to I'll be able to relay your questions at the end of the event. So just put them in the chat function whenever you feel like it. I will also be sharing a link during the event to the book of the moment, Burning Island, and please feel free to, after the event, just click on that link, pop it into your cart, and anything else that you put in your cart tonight will give you 10% off. So use the word event, EVENT, to get 10% off your purchase tonight. Thanks to the wonderful Jock Serong and bringing us this book tonight. We have a discount, which is great. So that's, you will be on mute for all of the event tonight, but at the end of the event, I will allow you to unmute yourself so that we can have a final clap. So just be waiting for that at the end of the event. Now, that's all from me. So I'm going to hand over to our guests tonight. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Jock Serong, whose novels have received the Ned Kelly Award for First Fiction and the Colin Roderick Award and the inaugural Staunch Prize. He lives with his family on Victoria's far west coast, and that is where we are zooming to tonight. So welcome to Jock. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Chrissy. G'day.
And talking to Jock tonight, we have Mirandi Riwoe, and Mirandi's novels include The Fish Girl, which was shortlisted for the Stella Prize, and Stone Sky Gold Mountain, which was shortlisted for 3 Queensland Literary Awards and won the Queensland Literary Award for Fiction just recently. So congratulations to Mirandi and welcome, and I'll hand it to you now.
Thank you, Chrissy. Hello, Jock.
Hello, mate. How are you?
I just want to first congratulate you on your captivating, beautiful seafaring novel.
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to give a quick rundown of how we entered this book, and then I'll grill you. So this new book of yours is set about 30 years after the events in your original novel in this series, Preservation. So we are introduced to Eliza Grayling, who's the daughter of Lieutenant Joshua Grayling, who's from the first novel. Joshua has lost his sight in the meantime, and he's quite ill. And when Scrivenus, who's also from the first novel, comes along and asks for assistance in investigating the disappearance of another ship, Eliza has to join her father on the voyage. So, first of all, I was just wondering what first drew you to this story after writing Preservation? Like what sort of, did you sort of find some stuff that sort of neatly pointed you in the direction, or how did you
well, it sort of works in reverse in that I had thought of a series of stories about these islands that covered about 50 years. And I think my first instinct was to write a novel in 3 parts that would deal with these 3 separate sets of incidents. And it was only once I started setting out what I thought was part 1, which turned out to be Preservation, that I realised the whole thing was so much bigger in scope than I had initially thought. So I wrote Preservation about the first part of the 50 years. And just to set that out, in 1797, the Sydney Cove is shipwrecked on Preservation Island, and the survivors walk to Sydney. So that's an extremely short synopsis of an entire novel. But what that did was to open up this completely unknown region to Sydney and to all of the commercial interests in Sydney. And that meant the fact that there were abundant seals in these islands, the fact that on the southern New South Wales coast there was coal, there were forestry interests that were opened up. And the biggest thing of all is the most obvious, which is that the survivors were living proof that there was a Bass Strait. There was a shorter way round to Sydney. That then meant that all of these sealers moved into the islands, and they were, at first they were young men who were often pardoned convicts or people on the run from one thing or another. Lots of Americans and Africans and Malays, all these different nationalities came into these little granite islands. And then by 1830, where I've set this novel, they had pretty much exhausted the seals. They'd driven 2 species to extinction. And there were only a handful of old men left, and they had Aboriginal wives from Tasmania, which is a really important cultural note in this sequence. And then after that comes George Augustus Robinson, the missionary, who tries to bring Tasmania's Aborigines into the islands and create a sort of Christian settlement there, which was an abject disaster. And so that settlement shuts in 1847, and there's the 50-year bracket.
Right.
So I guess at the moment I'm in the middle of that 50 years, and there's a number of spots in the 50 years that you could zero in on, but that's just where this book is.
Okay, so this is a question for later, but are you working on another one?
Yes, yeah, I am.
Okay.
I'm well into the next of them.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
Actually, yeah, I've been doing a workshop on historical fiction, and I was saying how a lot of your research will lead into, inspire more work, which is great about research.
I agree with you. And I wonder, Mirandi, if compared to writing contemporary novels, you have less of a sense when you're writing about history as to how big the project is. Because history has this strange way of concertinaing.
That's right. And so many stories.
What you think might be a confined incident turns out to be the grain of a much bigger discussion.
That is so true. Yeah. So this book is from Eliza Grayling's point of view, and she's a fabulous character. She's just so likable. She's tough. She's self-sufficient. She's observant, which is very handy, and hasn't had the easiest upbringing, and she has to look after her dad. How did you come to her as your protagonist?
I think mostly because I wrote Charlotte Grayling in Preservation. I really enjoyed her as a character, and I enjoyed what she did in the drama, which was to be a foil against Joshua. Joshua's kind of a detective figure, and Charlotte is his slightly smarter other half, who is constantly quizzing him about, are you really sure about your conclusions here?
That's right, yeah.
And when I came into this story, for reasons that become apparent in the novel, we've got no Charlotte, and I wanted to continue perhaps the tradition that she represents. And also, I guess with boats and with this era, you run into a practical problem that the minute you write a boat, it's going to be full of men. And you lose obvious interest and diversity in that. So I wanted to have a woman on the boat as a foil against 5 other blokes.
And also this book was just from her point of view, whereas Preservation, I seem to remember, was for, from quite a few points of view, and even like different sort of narrative positions. Was, as a writer, was that what led you to do that?
I think it's because the book follows a tradition that looks a bit like Heart of Darkness or Theseus and the Minotaur, or any of those sort of journeys into darkness. That the best way to explore them is from one person's interior perspective, because Eliza here has this extremely settled existence, as you referred to. She's a governess. She looks after her father. She's not married. She walks the same paths every day. She knows the same things. Nothing shifts for her. And all of a sudden, her world is completely upended. And all of these strange events and characters are swirling around her. And the best way to look at that, surely, is from the inside. You get to look at the other characters from her perspective rather than through that sort of omniscient gaze. Yeah,
no, it's very rich. I love it. So we were covering this before. All these books are set in the Bass Strait Island area, and I don't know much about the Bass Strait Islands or those Furneaux Islands, and I think probably many readers here don't either. So I was wondering if you could tell us about them, Jock, and what is this burning island?
Yeah, okay. To start with, in terms of locating ourselves, the easiest way to think about this is if you think about Tasmania as being triangular. If you look at it on a map, it's kind of in quotation marks, and the one on the left or in the west is King Island, which is exposed to the southwest, so it's stormy and dark, and it has dark rock, and it's kind of low. And then over in the east, the right-hand set of quotation marks is a group of islands, not a single one, called the Furneaux Group. And they're really the exact opposite. They're made of granite, and the granite is extremely silvery. And when it breaks down into sand, it makes this gorgeous quartz sand. So everything's kind of lit up, and they're very grassy, they're mountainous. There's a lot of bird life, and they're the continuation of the Great Divide coming down and into the east coast of Tassie. It's all the same rock. and it just has this gorgeous light about it. So
Mm.
it's the really curious juxtaposition of a physically beautiful place, which has quite a dark history. And you get a sense of that walking around there or sailing around there, that bad things happened here and a long time ago, and the place has almost gone back to sleep.
Okay.
It has a sense of slumber about it. It's quite eerie.
So, so when you visited, or when you've travelled around those islands, I take it, was that what inspired you to write about the islands, or did you go there to look at the islands?
I've been going.
You're inspired by the story.
Yeah, I've been going there since I was about 20, I suppose, and always known about. It's a small community, and small communities have that way of keeping and retelling stories. And the story of the Sydney Cove, the story of the sealers and of the Aboriginal settlement, which is called Waibelina, those stories are around you all the time. And I'd been aware of them for a long, long time going down there. And I suppose there was a creative itch about that I knew there was something you could make of that, but it's very hard to know whether you're the right person, or whether you know enough, or whether you can be entrusted with that story, how it will go over once you do retell it. Significant worries. So I think I had resisted writing about it for a long, long time. And, perhaps in recent years, the times felt right to do it. But even then, I think I've tiptoed into it, really.
Oh, that's interesting. So I'm going to read you a part. I'm going to read you a part of your book.
Oh, good.
This is, and it's such a beautiful passage. And it's from Eliza's point of view, and she's looking at the Danish boat Moonbird, I think schooner.
Yes.
Is that the right terminology? It's
as far as I know, yeah.
She was short, stout, and sleepy looking, and yet the very moment I saw her, I felt a deep affection I cannot explain. She was the tired hound that wants to sleep on your feet, idle yet watchful, able to tell the shadows of easy repose from those that should be barked at. She looked nothing like her neighbours. She was carvel built in heavy, dark timbers, 2 short, thick masts, strange diagonal rigging. The hull was heavy, reassuringly so, rounding through a fat waist to a stern that was almost a teacup. The main mast passed through a low cabin, while at the stern there was a modest quarterdeck. It's really beautiful, and really, like, she's obviously fond of this boat, schooner, loves it. I guess I was wondering, how do you research this schooner, this boat, and all the seafaring ways in the novel? Like, I was reading something just lately. I think it was Kim Scott was saying he wrote about a voyage, and he didn't do it. Like, he said that was just from research. And then of course there's Kate Mildenhall, who said she actually went on, you know, that voyage to see what it was like. Tell us about this boat.
Yeah. Well, I think firstly, in terms of what the drama does, I wanted the boat to be an ally. So the characters, each of them are going through their various journeys and their various torments, and the world keeps betraying them and deceiving them. And I wanted the boat to be a constant, and I wanted it to have this kind of faithful hound feel about it. Mm-hmm. So as they walk around, they're bumping into each other, and spaces are confined, but there's no sharp edges, and everything's rounded and smooth and welcoming underfoot and underhand. And so I had to think about what kind of boat would have that personality about it. A little bit heavy, but very dependable. And I did lots of research about that. And the good thing, I think, is that in Sydney at the time, we have a sense that all of the vessels were the same kind of vessel, that they were sort of these English clippers, which is probably a perception we get from illustrations of the First Fleet. In fact, there was a really multicultural fleet in Sydney at the time. There were lots of boats that came from other nations in order to exploit whales or seals or whatever it might be, and just trading. And there were lots of people who were shipwrights who came from other places who had other shipbuilding traditions. So there was every prospect that you could have quite an exotic vessel available for use in Sydney at the time. So that was one thing. The other, I think, is I had read a lot of an Australian writer called Patsy Adams Smith, who was a journalist who travelled on inter-island boats in the Furneaux group in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and wrote about her experiences.
Right.
She had this way of writing about the vessels. She had a great eye, and she was really good at sketching the characters of the men who did this work.
Right.
She was really good at sketching the boats and what it was like day to day below decks, what it was like being a woman on board, and the way you interacted with the men.
Isn't it so great when you find a key sort of text that can really help you get into your...
And as you know from Stone Sky Gold Mountain, when you get onto something that you know is taking you in an unconventional direction, it's not taking you down the well-trodden path. And that's really Patsy Adam Smith. And there was a passage somewhere where she talked about the way that the mast came down through the roof of the galley and straight through the dining table. Dining table's the wrong word, but where they ate.
Yeah.
And that the crew would decorate the huge foot of the mast coming through the table with wishbones from birds they'd eaten. It somehow, I think that was what gave me, I don't know that I used that directly, but that's what gave me the sense of the interiors.
Yeah, I love it. They
were cramped spaces, but they were cozy spaces, and they were full of little tiny traditions and rituals.
Yeah, no, it's beautifully realised. This is quite a long question. Bear with me. In the Burning Islands, you write about the Aboriginal women, which you've touched on, in the area of that time, women who were termed island wives to the sealers and other European settlers. And in your chat with Michael Veitch, you spoke of the different views or histories of these women, how it's important to know them. And in your notes, you mention, and you've mentioned them before, George Augustus Robinson. So in the novel, there's an interesting conversation between Eliza and Peacock. Peacock's an Aboriginal woman whose real name is Goni Anina. And they're talking about Taranora, another well-known Aboriginal woman of the time. And eventually, Goni Anina says to Eliza, "You don't understand it because you want a simple answer." I was wondering if you could discuss that.
Yeah, I felt like I was perhaps talking to myself there. Which is that I have been really interested in these movements of people for years now, and maybe it's the fading remnants of a lawyer brain, but I want an answer that makes internal sense, and there isn't one. There are multiple views about this history, and they're in conflict with each other. The sources are in conflict with each other. One of the most notable influences is that George Augustus Robinson wrote extensively about these islands and these women and these societies. But Robinson had his own agenda, and really he was a propagandist. He was a Christian missionary who wanted to put about the narrative that these people, i.e. the Palawa people of Tasmania, are in peril. I can save them. I'm going to create an idyllic society where they'll learn to read the Bible and sing songs. And it was never, ever going to work. But his entire extensive narrative in his journals, he wrote every day to the tune of thousands of words. And that entire narrative is devoted to making that look plausible. So it has kind of slid into becoming our archive or our accepted history of this period. But you have to look at it with a pretty skeptical eye.
Yes.
And the sources that either corroborate or contradict Robinson, they're all in the shadow of him. He's the dominant narrative, and you have to look really carefully to get other views of it.
Yeah.
So the one view is that the island wives, the Tairilo women, came to the islands of their own volition, and they had agency. They were equal partners with the sealers in hunting seals, flensing and trading the furs, hunting birds, hunting kangaroos. They were very capable swimmers. They were very capable with boats. And sometimes their partners were kind of busted up old men. The other side of this narrative is that a lot of them were abducted. They were in sexual and labour servitude to these men, and that this was not a happy union at all. And elements of both of those versions, I've tried to run both channels, I suppose, and to point out that individual cases differed quite a bit.
That's interesting. I guess it's a lot like even trafficked women now and different narratives.
Yes.
I did have, and you've answered it a bit, but I really liked the part with Louisa, and I think it's on preservation. I really like how you've described how they live, like the house and what they eat and what the women are doing, her character. It's so finely drawn. I was wondering, did you get that sort of setting and the character from anything you read in particular?
I'm trying to recall. It's amazing how old some of the ruined houses are on the island. There was a photo that a friend took of the interior of one of these old ruined cottages on an outlying island. And I had that photograph at the front of the manuscript as I wrote, and I kept looking into this room, and that gave me a lot of the visions for the interiors. There's mention here and there in published work about the way that the houses were done. For instance, that they used, all of the islands are covered in tussock grasses, various kinds of poas and spinifexes and things. And all the floors were laid with dried grasses. And I guess they were just swept out.
But nobody lives there now.
Sorry?
Nobody lives there now?
No.
No.
There are certainly 800 people on Flinders, and there are communities on Cape Barren Island and there are individuals on other islands. But the majority of the Furneaux Islands would be uninhabited. And visited. They were grazed at one stage, but I don't know that that's been sustainable in the modern era. A lot of them now are bird sanctuaries, national parks, or just out there quietly doing their thing. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? You know, where somewhere was just sort of booming in its time, and then I guess once it's been sort of robbed, people move out again.
That's a really interesting tension in that we're accustomed to any coastal area being gentrified, and at some stage the espresso machine arrives, and perhaps the opposite process has happened here, that the islands have become more and more empty and remote and quiet. Flinders itself is kicking on beautifully in terms of its tourism and the various artisan products that it produces, but the outlying islands are probably more silent now than they were in 1830.
Wow. So now I'm just going to go on to a few of the characters, Jock. What can you tell us about Gideon, the doctor? He's quite fascinating, I found. He's very elusive kind of character. So if you could tell us about him.
So Dr. Gideon is a paying passenger on the Moonbird, and he's a stranger to the other characters. He is on the boat, he says, because pictures of Bass Strait. And in that sense, he, I guess, is a riff on lots and lots of travelling naturalists from that era, people like Banks and Solander and Cuvier. And they were of a type in that they're not scientists the way we think of scientists now. They're more adventurers, and they were looking for celebrity as much as they were looking for scientific discovery. So there's this kind of grandiosity and a fair bit of ego about Gideon, that he wants to be the naturalist who discovered the secrets of the curvature of the Argonaut shell. And that's what led me into this sort of mad rabbit hole about Fibonacci and spirals.
Oh God, I can just imagine when I was reading that stuff.
Oh my God. And it's great fun, isn't it? That when
research.
But sometimes you go into the research looking for a thing, but then the research actually starts to write the story for you. And that was certainly the case with all of that stuff about spirals. It's on one analysis, it wasn't necessary to the plot, but on the other analysis, it was so much fun. There's no way I was going to stop.
Absolutely, it was necessary.
So
I think that's just so interesting what you say about how scientists then were like adventurers. Like I don't think I'd thought of it like that before.
Well, the thing
about a certain type of, like we think of scientists now, in the lab in their white coats, but they weren't. No.
Yes, and nor was it at all about objectivity. We're still 30 years short of Darwin here.
Yeah.
So the idea of natural selection and the theory of evolution are still ahead of us. And people studied these creatures pretty much in isolation, rather than as being part of an evolutionary sequence of some sort. Banks, when he made his trips to the Pacific and to Australia, he was a very young man, and he was an heir to a fortune. He was one of the wealthiest men in England.
Wow.
So the whole thing was a big fat lark. And he was very happy to be on a vessel making these discoveries, and he did very well. He did a good job of it. But he spent the majority of his life as landed gentry in England. He was a peer.
Right.
the idea of Banks that we have as having devoted a lifetime to science is just not correct. It was a thing.
No, it's just fascinating.
Hmm.
I was just the other day I was reading about other adventurers here, or explorers in Australia, and how it was kind of quite so amateur. So
Yes.
like an exhibition, like it was something like for the fair almost, and then they'd set off.
And I think sometimes the school version of who the explorers were and who the naturalists were has this terribly one-dimensional quality about it, that you're taught, these are the dates, this is the name, this is where they went, rather than this one was a pirate, this one was a speculator, this one was a genuine thinker, this one wrote lyrically, this one wrote really in a really wooden fashion. They were so variable, and yet you get a very flat image of them.
It's amazing. So in the book, Gideon's also writing a book about that maybe it's good to eat fish and seaweed and stuff like that. Now, I was wondering, did you find some sort of similar studies at the time?
Yes, there is.
That's amazing.
I'm so glad you asked this, because I hadn't actually spoken about this at all, but there was a guy called Dr. Henry Jeanneret. I love the fact that he's degenerate.
Yes.
But he was I think he was a medical doctor who came out from London, and he was desperate to be Australia's first dentist. And he was completely into teeth, which is why there are lots of little teeth references around Dr. Gideon. And Jeanneret wrote the first medical textbook written in Australia, and it was called something like A Study of the Health of Teeth. He then later on became the commandant of the Wibellina Aboriginal settlement on Flinders Island. And at one stage I had in mind to kind of write him in as a central villain, because his reputation as commandant was appalling. And in fact, the Aboriginal residents of Wibellina wrote a petition to the Queen saying, can you please not send us this guy again? He's been appalling. And that was in itself a sort of landmark moment in Aboriginal advocacy, that they wrote this petition. So Jeanneret was a really weird character and not a particularly pleasant one. But for a variety of reasons, including discovering some enthusiastic descendants, I decided not to take him on head on. Elements of Jeanneret appear in Gideon, but only elements.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I did wonder about that. That's very interesting. He's a very, very fascinating character. I really enjoyed reading him. And Argyle, the master, it seems that we both write about cross-dressers. I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, because you talked about it with Michael on the weekend. So can you tell us how you came to Argyle? He's a lovely character.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it, when you say that the reasons that you wrote Ying in a cross-dressing sense are so different from the reasons I wrote Argyle cross-dressing. And it's fascinating that the two things can hold when cross-dressing is so often fetishized for other reasons. There are these interesting practical and spiritual dimensions to why someone might do it. So Argyle is the skipper of the Moonbird, although it's not his boat. He's as fond of it as Eliza is. But as the boat leaves Sydney and comes around South Head, he goes below decks and comes up in a dress and says nothing at all about it. And the odd thing is that the characters, as they go along, they become more and more accustomed to it. And it's new strangers who see him who react each time. But the people on the boat are by now completely accustomed to it. And that reminded me a little bit of something I read about early Sydney, that there were so many nude people in the streets in early Sydney because of the number of Aboriginal people who had come into the township, that the locals were completely inured to nudity, and it didn't faze them at all. But that each time a new ship arrived, everybody would be scandalised.
Right.
So there's a kind of analogy to that here, that the passengers are completely used to Argyle and his cross-dressing ways. But the reasons for his cross-dressing I saved up to the very, very end of the book. And I don't know whether what I've said is psychologically right, but it felt instinctively to me like there was this point to make there. And I guess time will tell whether that's convincing or it's not convincing, but Argyle's got his reasons.
Oh yeah, I thought it was great. I just really liked how, I like that way of that he just comes out with the dress on, doesn't say anything,
Yep.
no explanation,
Play
and
on.
they just have to live with it.
Yes.
I think that is how a lot of things should get across.
And also a little bit, again, like what you've done with Ying, it doesn't follow that there's a set of behaviours that go with the costume. He is still a sort of crusty mariner. And I talk at times about his hands or his arms or his chest protruding from this dress. And he's not trying to act his way into the dress in any sense at all. And that was kind of important to point out, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Lastly, I want to ask about Srinivas, the Lascar, who's, I think he's Bengali or
Yes.
I think they used to say Hindu with 2 O's at the end.
Yes.
So he revisits us in this novel from Preservation. For my novels, I like to research, you know, the women and the Asians of, you know, like Victorian London or Australia, you know, like what they were doing here, because they're not, you don't see them in a lot of fiction at all, you know, unless they're like the exotic servant or something. So, but actually, interestingly, you can find evidence of just normal Asian people wandering around, and you've written a bit about it in this novel, and you touched upon it before. So I just had this. This is a paragraph this time. So this is Eliza. Scrivener is talking to Eliza. Eliza's listening to him. They made a success of it, he said. Old differences persisted. The Indians were never invited into the drinking, the shooting parties, but a basic level of respect was shown. It raises a question, he suggested. If each of us, and by us I understood him to include me, came from the old world, from Dublin, Birmingham and Leith in Massachusetts, from Calcutta, perhaps, then how much of that is left behind and how much becomes this place? Which I think is a great paragraph. What, can you discuss this and how you found your way into Srinivas, even originally?
Yeah, so originally I was fascinated by the fact that when I did the sort of just the nuts and bolts research on the Sydney Cove, one of the most interesting things that emerged immediately was that it had 55 men on it, and something like, I struggle to remember now, but 34, 38 of them were Lascars. They were South Asians of Malay, Indian, Chinese, even Vietnamese or Thai descent, who were brought together as indentured labour for mainly the English. And they were paid a fraction of what the English were paid. They were fed scraps. And across all of their differing cultures and religions, they formed a kind of subculture of their own, its own traditions. This went on over centuries, and fathers passed the job down to sons, and there were ranks among them, and a very, very deep culture. And I was so fascinated by this that the reason I wrote Srinivas in Preservation was to explore that and what it meant in terms of the shipwreck, that it was the Lascars, of course, who copped it in the neck. The Englishmen or the Scotsmen had the upper hand at all times. Once I'd done that in Preservation, I then wanted to flip the idea of Srinivas from being a child at the mercy of these larger forces to a man who might have been a successful immigrant and who had made a name for himself. So it was another whole way of looking at the immigrant experience in early Sydney. And as you say, anybody who came from someone else brought the traces of that place, but equally they got a new start. And to me, and Eliza is currency. She's born in Australia, but her father wasn't, Srinivas wasn't. All of these other people had brought other influences in. So it was a way of refreshing the character and changing his approach, but also it was a way of exploring the immigrant experience, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. I just find it really amazing when we read things that confirm there were so many different cultures here at that time, you know, that we just, we always think, you know, and especially because when you watch BBC sort of productions in the past, it's getting better now, but, you know, where it's all just white people when actually there was a mixture.
Yes.
I've got a couple of, we're running out of time. I've got so many questions I want to ask you about writing historical fiction. But first, I think maybe we'll get you to do that reading.
Oh,
and
sure.
then I'll ask you the question.
Okay. Okay, so this was what we talked about earlier. This is approaching an island called Redondo. And Redondo, the Victorians here will be nodding sagely and going, ah, yes, Redondo. Redondo is a big, steep, black lump of rock off the tip of Wilson's Promontory. And it's the first of the islands that you encounter if you leave Victoria heading towards the Furneaux Islands. And unlike Wilson's Prom, which is just visually delightful, Redondo has this very, very grim aspect about it. And well, I'll read you the passage and then I'll do a bit more explaining about it.
Excellent.
Okay. What I could see as the last breaths of fog drew away was a nest of small huts joined together to each other to form a continuous roof. The timbers were of various kinds, boughs that appeared to silver from immersion, planks and boards that were milled, some curved to betray their origins as the bones of ships. Iron bolts rusted in the air where the builders had neglected to pull them free. The structures huddled in a saw-cut ridge running horizontally across the cliffs. The shrubs grown up over their low sides showed that these people had been here a very long time, but none of these things were my concern. What concerned me was the men. They had pressed forward at sea level, 6 of them that I could see, but I felt certain there were others hiding among the shrubs and wreckage and boulders. 2 men advanced in the water to ankle depth. A dull sound emanated, gathered mutters that blurred into one constant low and malignant stirring. They were armed. Some carried clubs fashioned from scraps. 1 or 2 bore a hook or a crude blade of scrap iron. There were short swords that looked to be of naval issue. One of the men at water level had a rifle, and now I saw that another was braced higher, supported by a boulder, with a carbine levelled at the Moonbird. We had sailed deep enough into the small bay that they were now able to cover us from 3 sides. Nothing about their faces or any of the sounds from the island gave a clue as to their intentions. They just watched us.
I love, look, reading that in the novel it just really stayed with me. It's so creepy. And really, you know, you just wouldn't want to be there. Tell us about that scene.
Well, now I'm trying to think, I'll get this wrong about the source, but I think it was George Bass, who came around on one of his voyages of exploration very early on. And what he encountered was a group of maybe 14 convicts had stolen a boat and escaped from Sydney years before. And they were headed down into the Straits in order to go sealing. Oh, no, sorry, they were heading into the Straits to find the wreck of the Sydney Cove because everybody in Sydney knew that it was still piled up with booze. And there were rumours about it having treasure on it. And so these convicts had taken a boat and escaped and tried to find the Sydney Cove. And their plan was, wacky as this may sound, they were going to rebuild it and sail it away and make their fortune. They got as far as Redondo and they wound up there. And when Bass came around years later, he found them kind of these wild men, half clothed and completely mad on Redondo Island, throwing rocks at him. And he had to make a decision about rescuing them. And the decision, as I recall this, he may have picked up 1 or 2 of them, but the others, he gave a handful of supplies and said, sorry, you're not coming on board. And he sailed off on them. And I loved the idea of these madmen clinging to a rock in Bass Strait because their plans, their dreams had died with them.
So
that's
vivid.
where it comes from.
Oh, yeah, it's a great scene. I love that one. It's so creepy.
It's like deliverance, doesn't it?
It's so creepy, but it's so threatening too, you know, like, because you think of yourself on a ship, you'd think of yourself as being quite safe, you know.
Yes.
They were at risk.
And what quickly happens in that scene is that the clumsiness of the vessel, you know, its inability to maneuver in and out quickly means that they find themselves in the fog right up against the shore and within reach climbing on.
Yeah.
And they can't back the thing
out. It's like zombie stuff, Jock. It really is. That's exactly what it was like. It was like zombie stuff. Now, something I really appreciated in this novel, I guess, as another historical fiction writer, was that your characters aren't overly prescient. You know, they're not, you know, too pious, or, you know, they're not looking to, you know, like how they would act now, say. And I must have read Eliza differently from what Michael did, because he said he thought she was a bit revolted by what Gideon was up to, whereas I read her as quite accepting of what Gideon was doing all the things he was dissecting and eating downstairs. And she was still attracted to him. So, I mean, obviously she wasn't sort of turned off by him too much. And also the ceiling. I remember in the 80s, there were those, you know, the fur ceiling. There was just so much footage. There was quite a big movement to stop the fur ceiling at the time, and a lot of distressing footage about ceiling was, you know, at the time. And I think you get across the senselessness of all the sealing that must have happened there, and that there'd probably be extinction and everything. But you do it without the characters being overly prescient about it. Like, they're not. I found and I was waiting to see if you'd do it, if they'd do the whole, this is terrible, they're going to get rid of all the seals, but they didn't, which is, thank you. Can you tell me how you avoid, I mean, being too present? Because in some ways it's, you know, alluring to be present because it's right. You know, you don't want to be, you don't want to be saying these terrible things and thinking people think you think it, you know.
Yes.
So how do you go around this sort of prescience in historical fiction?
Well, yeah, it's a difficult thing. And I can remember when reading where you had done Lai Yu in Stone Sky, that he's watching a massacre from memory, isn't he? Or he's near to one.
Sorry,
and you have to do that without making overt modern judgments about what the characters are seeing. It's the same thing. The advantage of having a scientist on board, or a naturalist, is that he does ask himself the question at one stage, which is, hang on, if that's a female and they're clubbing it to death, then the young are going to die as well. So you're effectively killing 5 or 6 seals today. And surely that can't add up. He does sort of go through that calculation at one point, but not in a particularly judgmental way. And the temptation to bring a modern judgment to this is obvious. What's interesting about the sealing is that, as I said earlier, there was a gold rush. People just flooded down there. There were allegedly 10,000 people in the islands at one point, and they wiped out 2 of the 5 species locally. At the same time, they were seeding all of these societies. The town that I live in, Port Fairy, was brought about because of sealers finding land bases and transacting with Aboriginal people. Launceston largely owes its existence to sealers. All of these different places, places in Western Port Bay, and certainly the islands. So while they were eradicating these animals, they were also building townships. So the dynamics work in 2 different directions, I suppose. But I think, going back to your question, when I wrote Java Ridge, I had a 9-year-old girl who was really whip smart. And there's a bit of an artifice in that, which is that if you have a smart kid, you can watch the world in an observant way through their eyes. If you've got a dopey kid who's not particularly interested in life, it's harder to do. And the same thing applies with Eliza. She's smart and she's observant. And that means that you can convey her observations to a reader without it looking too forced. I guess Gideon's a bit the same. He's studying the natural world, which means that I get to bang on about fish and birds all the time, which is a thing to do.
Yeah, that's great. He's a great character. Chrissy, are there questions? Or
there are some questions. Shall we go to some questions first, or do you want?
Yeah, I've got a few more, so we can do the other questions, and then if there's time,
we'll come back to you. So we've got a lot of writers watching tonight. So your conversation has been fascinating in terms of writing historical fiction. And a couple of the writers have asked some questions, actually. So Laura Elvery has asked, was there something you thought was true before you started writing the book and then discovered to be totally wrong during your research, Jock?
Gee, that's a great question. Yes. Yeah, I think so. Or perhaps rather than true and false, it was more that things that I thought had one dimension turned out to have multiple dimensions. And one of those is trusting the archive, that it should be an obvious lesson. It took me a while to learn it, that the people who give you the archive gave it to you out of their own motivations, and indeed unconsciously out of their own social standing. They were a particular type of person. And if you take that at face value as fact, then you're robbing yourself of multiple other perspectives on the thing. There's that. There's also, as I said earlier, the fact that the dynamics of how the Tirelaw women came into the islands there are multiple versions of that. I thought that, okay, if I read enough about this, I'll get to the bottom of why and how it was happening. And all I did was get further and further from a concluded position. So I think those are the major things. I guess the truths that came out of it were that, another thing that got murkier and murkier, not clearer and clearer, was what in fact happened to this boat. So the quest in the Burning Island is to find a missing boat. And the boat I've called the Howrah is actually based upon a real shipwreck called the Britomart, which was 9 years later. And the Britomart disappeared. The newspapers in Sydney said they've all been murdered. They were lured by false lights and they've all been murdered for a fortune in coins that was destined for a bank in Tasmania. Some of that is probably nonsense and it sold newspapers just like it does now. But some of it turns out to be probably true. And I found an old local well after I'd finished writing the book who said to me, I know where they're buried. It was horrifying. We were standing eyeball to eyeball in the airport waiting for a plane at Flinders Island. And he said, I know where they're buried. They were all murdered. So what you think is clear turns out to be as murky as hell. But that's kind of the fun of it as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. There's also a question here from Tony Jordan, who thanks Mirandi, she says, and hi, Jock. I've always found the idea of justice to be an important theme in your work. Do you agree? Does justice feature in Burning Island, and why is it an important theme for you?
Thanks, Tony. I think it does matter to me, although it's not something that I want to be too self-conscious and deliberate about. I like the fact that it's there as a kind of animating force in the writing, but it would be the height of pomposity if you were to then go imposing judgments about things. Here, there's not justice, and indeed what there is an exploration of more and more injustice, and I think that's where the series of 3 books are going. That what happened in Tasmania and in the Furneaux Islands was a catastrophic injustice. There was not a kind of resolution to this that would satisfy anybody. And the fascinating thing is that modern Palawa people, Tasmanian Aboriginal people, are still fighting for an identity and a voice and the recognition of important places. And there's so much more work to do in that area, you know? So identifying and talking about old injustices that were just awful events is perhaps an early step on the road to working towards modern justices. But that's an entirely separate discussion that's ongoing. There's a great film called Black Man's Houses, made by Steve Thomas in 1990, which is a doco about the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and about Waibalina and what happened on Flinders Island. And it does an excellent job of showing how far into the modern era the same injustices have been replicated. You know, commemorating grave sites only to have them bulldozed in modern decades. So we have a long way to go, and that's probably going to be the subject of other people's writing, I guess, along the way.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here from Josephine Taylor, who has actually suggested that a book by Sarah Drummond, The Sound, is an interesting look at Island wives. You aware of that one? Yeah,
I've met Sarah and had a chat to her about her book. It's about Southwest Western Australia from memory. Okay. And yes, talks about similar things.
Well, Josephine's asked, do you find yourself dislocated in time when writing in this way, stranded somehow after the book is done?
Yeah, you do. And Mirandi's probably familiar with a similar sensation, that you invest so much emotionally and intellectually in climbing into that world that it feels a little bit odd when there's no more edits left to do. You go through whinging phases where you think to yourself, oh God, I've got to go through this thing again and adjust and work on bits and pieces. But then when there actually comes a day where you know you've done the last edit and the thing is off to a printer, there's a tiny little grieving that goes on where you have to step outside that world again, because you work so hard on creating logic for that world that by the time you step out again and think about, okay, what other stories are there and how can I tell them? You kind of long for all the logic that you set up. And particularly walking out of this one, we walked into the world of the pandemic, you know, and life is ridiculous and sad. And in there, somehow it made a kind of internal sense to me.
we've got a question here from Susanna about the descendants of characters when you're writing fiction like this. Have you had any kind of conversations with descendants or pushback from descendants of characters that you've used?
No, not active pushback. The interesting thing about the islands is that a lot of the surnames of the sealers are literally people you will walk into in the supermarket. And every time it happens, I find it completely amazing. And these are modern people with clear consciences and an interest in their own history. I've never had, well, I've had very few direct conversations with those families about these types of issues. And I imagine there are probably sensitivities there, but I've never had pushback. It's more been a sense locally in the islands that if this is the story that you want to tell, and if you do it properly, then go for your life. But there is an implicit sense of don't just waddle in and do this badly. There's that. On the other hand, when I wrote Preservation, I did a lot of looking around to see if Clark had descendants because I made moral judgments about Clark. I mentioned earlier about Dr. Jenneret. There's definitely descendants there. So to be honest, I would have to say I do have a careful look over both shoulders and that you do feel a little bit of relief if you get a sense that there are not active descendant groups. If there are, then I think you owe an obligation to consult and be respectful, particularly, you know, massively where Aboriginal people are concerned, but where all descendants are concerned.
So glad I don't write historical fiction. Look, we have a few minutes left. So Mirandi, if you had
well, I do have one question that ties in with what you just said, Kissy, about glad that you don't write historical fiction. Jock, you probably don't remember this, but my very first panel ever in the whole world was at Byron. You and Michael Rowbotham.
Yeah.
And I wrote historical fiction. I think yours was for On Java Ridge. And Michael was saying, he said he would never write historical fiction because he would be too scared that he'd get something wrong. So I guess my question to you is, one historical writer to another, how do you get past that fear, or has it ever paralyzed you or anything like that? About getting something wrong and then finding out later.
Well, this is a dodge, but I think the more you explore the word wrong, it's all wrong.
Okay.
So what you do...
I like that answer. I love that answer. Finish.
Yeah. Other than, I think archaeologists have it good because they dig a hole and there's something in the hole and the thing can't lie. But in terms of documented history, in terms of the archive, everybody's come at it with an angle. And what you're doing is adding an angle to this massive pile of angles. And provided that you do that in a spirit of honesty and the spirit of some rigor, you know, doing your homework and talking to people,
absolutely,
then you go in knowing you're going to make mistakes and just accepting that.
That's cool. That's such a great question, Mirandi. And I have to admit, like, sorry to barge in here, but when I listened to George Saunders talk about Lincoln in the Bardo, it was incredibly freeing. And it was the first time that I thought, maybe I could set something historically, because he kind of said, oh, look, I don't even truck with history. You know, I can take some figments and make fiction up. This is fiction. I can do what I want with it. And it kind of felt a bit freeing, I suppose, for us.
Isn't there that thing about George Saunders that he has this way of talking that is so generous that you get the sense that everything's okay, and then you walk away going, but hang on, the bloke's a genius.
But that's George Saunders.
I don't know these things apply to us all.
It made me feel better about the idea of writing historical fiction. I take my hat off to both of you. I think that it's an incredibly difficult job, and to do it well, as you both do, is a really, really challenging act, and such a gift to a reader. So thank you both very much for this incredibly informative workshop, really, that we've all been listening to.
Thanks for the practice, Jock.
Thank you, Mirandi.
And when it goes up on YouTube, you can share it with all those other authors who are writing historical fiction and wanting some tips and pointers, because this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Can
Thank
I
you,
say
Avid.
quickly before we drop away into cyberspace, Mirandi, congratulations to you on your clean sweep of the Queensland Awards. Well done.
Thank you, Jock. You're very
Just
sweet.
terrific and well deserved.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
for
tonight. I loved your novel. Thank you for being in a Q&A with me. Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
And now it's our time to have one final round of applause. So I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves, and I'm going to watch you all as I change it to gallery view.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much to Mirandi and to Jock. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Jock.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Oh, how lovely. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. That was really great. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.